Chapter 1. The Unexpected Visitor. David Holbrook's life was ordinary. In fact, it was so ordinary that if you were to describe it, it would seem almost like a template for small-town existence. He worked as a mechanic in the sleepy town of Harbinger, a place that, from a distance, appeared as though it hadn't changed for decades. The town, with its crumbling brick buildings and rusted vehicles that dotted every corner, seemed locked in time, caught somewhere between the past and an uncertain future. The weathered roads, the quiet hum of life that seemed to be stuck in perpetual motion, everything about Harbinger exuded a certain charm, but it was the kind of charm that only spoke to those who had lived there long enough to become comfortable with its slow, predictable pace. It wasn't a place that made you feel alive. It was a place that made you feel settled. And for David, that was exactly what he had always wanted. Peace. Simplicity. The same routine, day in and day out. David's work as a mechanic was the cornerstone of his existence. He ran a modest garage, a small, gray building that had been passed down through generations of mechanics in his family. The rusted wrench named after the signature tool his grandfather had designed was David's haven. It was a place where he could escape from the mundanity of life, where the whir of engines, the clang of wrenches, and the smell of motor oil filled the air, offering him solace. Fixing vehicles, no matter how old or dilapidated, gave him a sense of purpose. To him, there was nothing more satisfying than seeing something broken come back to life. No matter how outdated or dysfunctional the machine, David could make it work. It was his gift, his curse, and his way of making sense of the world. He wasn't alone in his work. The town's residents often came by with their rusty hovercars, old bikes, and other mechanical failures that had long since been abandoned by the local tech companies. David's clientele wasn't wealthy. They were the ordinary folk who lived in Harbinger, just scraping by in a world that had long passed them by. Harbinger wasn't a place that got a lot of attention from the city dwellers or the big corporations. It was a forgotten pocket of the world, tucked away between hills and overgrown forests, and no one ever seemed to visit unless they had a reason to pass through. And David liked it that way. He had lived here his whole life, worked in his father's footsteps, and watched the world change outside the walls of his small town, but never felt the need to change with it. It was on one ordinary evening just like every other that David's quiet world came to an unexpected halt. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the horizon as he worked on yet another broken-down hovercar that had somehow managed to find its way into his workshop. The vehicle had seen better days, its once shiny chrome frame now covered in rust, and its engine sputtering with every attempt to start it. David grumbled under his breath as he wiped his hands on an oily rag, cursing the machine's stubbornness. He had been at it for hours, but every turn of the wrench only seemed to make matters worse. David wasn't sure how much time had passed when it happened. A sudden, sharp flash of light streaked across the sky. It wasn't like the usual stars or the glint of satellites passing overhead. This light was far brighter, far more intense, and it seemed to move faster than anything David had ever seen. It was as if the very night sky had split open and something had torn through the darkness at impossible speed. David stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the brilliant light, unsure whether he was seeing things or whether something truly extraordinary was happening. He had seen meteor showers before, had even watched shooting stars streak across the sky, but this was something different. This light wasn't falling. It was moving, curving, almost as if it was guided by some unseen force. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. The streak of light was coming closer. It wasn't just a star shooting across the night sky. It was an object, large and moving with incredible speed, and it was heading straight for Harbinger. David's heart raced as he watched the light get closer, now clearly visible as a fiery trail, burning bright against the darkness. In a split second, the glowing object suddenly shifted direction, veering downward at an astonishing rate. It was heading directly toward his workshop. Without thinking, David dropped the wrench he had been holding and bolted outside. The air was thick with the anticipation of something unknown. He could feel the vibrations beneath his feet as the object grew nearer, the sound of it slicing through the atmosphere now audible, like a low rumble that vibrated his very bones. It was coming fast, far too fast, and for a moment, David thought he might have misjudged its trajectory. Maybe it wasn't coming for him. Maybe it was just passing overhead. But then, with a sound that shook the air, the object crashed into the ground with an explosion of light and debris, sending a shockwave that knocked David off his feet and sent him sprawling to the ground. The force of the impact left the air thick with smoke, and the faint glow of the object in the sky flickered out, leaving only the echoes of the blast and the ringing in David's ears. He lay there for a moment, dazed, trying to gather his bearings, unsure of what had just happened. When he managed to push himself upright, he could see the trail of fire and smoke still lingering in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest as adrenaline surged through him. Without thinking twice, David sprinted toward the crash site. His mind raced with questions. Was it a meteorite? A satellite that had malfunctioned? Or, God help him, was it something more? The wreckage was a few hundred yards away, near the edge of the woods behind his shop. As David approached, the debris from the crash site scattered across the ground in a haphazard, chaotic spread. There were pieces of what looked like metal, shiny and smooth, reflecting the dim light of the setting sun, and a strange, pulsating glow coming from the center of the crash. His curiosity pushed him forward, and when he arrived at the source of the glow, what he saw made him freeze in place. There, amidst the smoldering wreckage, was something that could only be described as otherworldly. The object wasn't a simple meteor or satellite. It was a craft of some kind, sleek and metallic, with curves and angles that seemed to defy human design. Its surface shimmered in the fading light, covered in markings that David couldn't understand. The ship, or whatever it was small, no larger than a car, but it had clearly been through hell. Smoke billowed from a hole in the side, and the ground around it was scorched. But what truly shocked David was the figure standing in front of it. A woman, or at least what appeared to be a woman, stood amidst the wreckage. She was tall, far taller than any human woman, and she wore a form-fitting suit that shimmered like liquid silver. Her skin had a faint, ethereal glow to it, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that David could hardly comprehend. They were unlike any human eyes he had ever seen, large, with a swirling pattern of light inside them, shifting like the stars themselves. She stood there, unscathed by the explosion, her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. She seemed to be taking in her surroundings, clearly disoriented by the crash. David stood there, unable to speak, his breath caught in his throat. What in the world was happening? He had never seen anything like this before. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them seemed to make sense. The woman turned toward him, her gaze locking onto his, and David felt an inexplicable pull, a sense that this moment, this encounter, was something far bigger than anything he had ever experienced. Who are you? David finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper, as the woman took a slow step toward him. She smiled, and the expression was both gentle and knowing, as if she had expected this moment to happen. I am not from here, human, she said, her voice soft but clear, with a melodic tone that seemed almost alien. I come from a distant world, far from your own. David's mind was spinning, unable to fully process her words. Alien? From another world? This couldn't be real. And yet, standing before him was proof in the form of a living, breathing being from the stars. His heart raced, and he took a tentative step back, unsure of what to do or say next. Why are you here? He finally asked, his voice steadying despite the panic that still gripped him. The woman looked down at the wreckage of her ship, her eyes darkening for a moment. I am stranded, she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. My ship was damaged during the journey, and I have no way of returning home. I do not wish to cause harm, but I am in need of assistance. David blinked, still trying to process everything. What happened? How did you end up here? I was fleeing a war, she replied, her voice softening. My planet is no more. And now, I find myself here alone. David's heart went out to her. It wasn't just the shock of encountering an alien. It was the raw vulnerability in her voice, the weight of loss that she carried in her words. He didn't understand it all, he couldn't, but in that moment, he felt something stir deep inside him. The need to help. The need to fix something that seemed broken in a way he couldn't comprehend. All right, David said, his voice more confident now, despite the chaos in his mind. I'll help you. We'll figure it out. But you need to tell me everything. Everything you can. The alien woman nodded, a faint smile appearing on her lips. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with a strange mix of relief and gratitude. "I will explain everything. But first, I must tend to my ship. I will need your help in more ways than you can imagine." David wasn't sure what he had just signed up for, but as he looked at the alien woman before him, he knew one thing for sure: his life was never going to be the same again. Chapter 2. The Shocking Truth. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and conversation as David helped the alien woman who introduced herself as Zathira repair her ship. The wreckage of the craft, though initially daunting, revealed a more advanced technology than anything David had ever seen. The materials that made up the ship were not only lightweight but incredibly durable, seemingly immune to the damage caused by the crash. Zathira guided him through the repair process, explaining in vague terms the functions of her technology, though much of it was beyond his understanding. As they worked, Zathira opened up more about her past, her people, and the circumstances that had led to her arrival on Earth. Her planet, a distant world known as Eloria, had been a peaceful place, inhabited by an advanced race of beings with remarkable technology. But that peace had been shattered when war erupted between factions vying for control of their planet's resources. Zathira had been part of a peaceful group trying to escape the conflict, but in the process, her ship was damaged, and she had been forced to crash land on Earth. Her people were scattered, lost to the chaos of the war, and now she was alone, stranded in a foreign world with no way to return home. The more David listened, the more his understanding of the universe expanded. He had never considered that something so vast, so different, could exist beyond the small, familiar world he had always known. And as Zathira spoke, her vulnerability and strength mixed in a way that made David feel both honored and fearful. The weight of the responsibility to help her, to understand her plight, pressed heavily on him, but he knew that somehow, he couldn't turn away. Something inside him had shifted, and now, there was no going back. It wasn't long before David realized that this wasn't just a simple repair job anymore. This wasn't just about fixing a broken machine. This was about repairing something far more fragile: Zathira's hope, her sense of belonging. She wasn't just stranded on Earth. She was stranded in a world that could never understand her, a place where she had no family, no home, and no allies. As the night wore on, and the ship began to come back to life, a strange thought occurred to David. Could he, a simple mechanic from Harbinger, really be the one to help this alien woman? Could he fix something so far beyond him? The answer wasn't clear, but as Zathira turned to him, her eyes gleaming with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that hinted at a future David wasn't prepared for, he realized that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be ordinary. David slowly made his way closer to the wreckage, his steps tentative at first, though the curiosity driving him forward was undeniable. His heart was racing in his chest as his breath caught in his throat. He had never experienced anything like this in his life. The fiery trail had turned into an ember, now fading with the blackened smoke of the object's descent. As the world around him grew quieter, save for the distant rumbling of the wreckage settling, his mind spun in circles. What was this thing? Had he just witnessed some kind of meteorite crashing to the Earth, or was this something entirely different? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he had to see it, had to understand it. Reaching the smoldering site of the crash, the ground was scorched black, the heat still radiating from the impact point. The wreckage was unmistakable, a twisted, alien piece of technology, sleek and gleaming, with strange runes etched along its surface. It had an organic look, as if it was alive, something that no earthly technology could match. David stood frozen for a moment, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. This wasn't a conventional crash site. This wasn't a plane or some random piece of debris. This was something far more advanced. But what really struck him was the figure that stood among the wreckage. The person, or rather, the being, was clearly humanoid, but something far beyond human. She was tall, almost unnaturally so, and her skin seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, a soft, silvery hue that didn't quite look like any human skin David had ever seen. Her eyes were unlike anything he had ever imagined, wide and luminous, glowing faintly with an intensity that seemed almost hypnotic. She stood tall, surveying the wreckage, her presence commanding yet somehow distant, as though she didn't quite belong here. For a moment, David hesitated. His feet were rooted to the ground, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. But then the figure turned, her gaze meeting his, and he could feel the air between them shift. It was an electric kind of silence, one that seemed to stretch out in time. Her presence seemed to fill the air, pressing down on David's chest as he stood frozen, unsure of how to approach her. "Are you okay?" David finally managed to ask, the question coming out more as a croak than anything else. He had no idea what else to say. What did one even say to an alien who had just crash-landed in your town? The woman alien, whatever she was, took a slow step toward him, her expression unreadable. The space between them seemed to stretch, each step she took drawing her closer with an unnatural grace, like she was moving through water. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost melodic, and had an alien cadence that David had never heard before. "I am not from here," she said, her words carefully measured, as if choosing them with great thought. "I come from a distant world. My name is Lyra. I have come in peace, but I am stranded." David blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. The sheer weight of her words hit him like a wave. She wasn't from here. She wasn't just some lost tourist or someone playing a prank. This was an alien, a being from another world, speaking to him. And yet, there was a certain sadness in her voice, a vulnerability he hadn't expected. She wasn't just stranded in a physical sense. No, this was something far deeper. She was stranded in a world that had no understanding of her, a place where she didn't belong. He shook his head slightly, still unsure if his senses were playing tricks on him. You're serious, aren't you?" David finally said, his voice trailing off in disbelief. You really are from another planet?" Lyra nodded solemnly, her gaze never leaving his. "Yes," she replied, her eyes softening. "I am, and I need your help." David's brain was struggling to catch up. The words felt alien in themselves, like they couldn't quite fit into his reality. He was a mechanic, a guy who spent his days under the hood of old cars and fixing machines that no one cared about anymore. How was he supposed to help someone from another planet? The thought was absurd. His entire life had been about solving simple problems now. Here he was, standing in front of a being who was asking him to fix something that wasn't even remotely human. I don't know what I can do for you," David stammered, feeling his heart race. "I'm just a mechanic. You need someone who dash." "I don't need a scientist or a specialist," Lyra interrupted gently, her voice quiet but firm. "I need someone who can help me get back to my ship. And maybe someone who can help me fix it." The weight of her words hit David like a sledgehammer. She wasn't just stranded in the physical sense. Her ship was damaged, and she had no way to fix it on her own. And that, David realized with a strange sense of clarity, was where he came in. Despite his disbelief, something inside him clicked. She was asking for his help, for his expertise in fixing things. In that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could actually do something to help. It wasn't going to be easy, and he wasn't sure how he was supposed to fix a spaceship, but there was something about Lyra, something in her eyes, that made him feel as though this was the right thing to do. "I can help you," David said, his voice more confident now, as if making the decision to help her had solidified something within him. "But we're going to need to take a closer look at your ship. I'm not sure what I can do, but I'll do what I can." Lyra's face softened, a hint of relief crossing her features. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "You don't know what this means to me." David nodded, though the enormity of the situation still hadn't fully hit him. He was about to help an alien get back to her homeworld. The thought was ridiculous, yet it was happening right in front of him. He didn't know how to process it. But there was no turning back now. The woman, the alien, was depending on him, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt a strange pull to help her, to see this through. "Let's go," David said, walking toward the wreckage, where Lyra was standing patiently, her eyes fixed on him with an unreadable expression. "Let's see what we're working with." As they approached the wreckage together, David felt the weight of the moment settle around him. His life, the one he had thought was simple and predictable, had just taken an unexpected turn. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, he was in this for the long haul. And as the two of them moved toward the strange, glowing craft, the distant stars above seemed to shimmer in a way they never had before, as if they were guiding him on a journey he had never imagined. Chapter 2. The Strangest of Requests. The wreckage of Lyra's ship was unlike anything David had ever seen. It was small, compact, and yet its design was far beyond anything Earth had created. The metallic surface was smooth, almost organic, with intricate patterns etched into it. The ship looked as though it had been molded rather than constructed, a fluid, seamless design that seemed to reflect light in a way that made it appear to shimmer. But despite its otherworldly beauty, it was clear that it had been through a violent crash. Sections of it were caved in, and dark smoke still rose from parts of the hull. David knelt beside the wreckage, inspecting the damage as best as he could. Lyra stood quietly nearby, watching him with an intensity that seemed to say more than words ever could. She wasn't just a passenger in all this. She was a part of it. She was tied to this ship in ways David didn't yet understand. "So, how does this thing work?" David asked, more to himself than to Lyra as he studied the intricate systems that lay exposed in the wreckage. "This doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before." Lyra approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the ship with an expert's gaze. "It is a craft designed for interstellar travel," she explained, her voice quiet but confident. "My people have perfected the technology of faster-than-light travel, using energy conduits that allow the ship to bend space. The damage is extensive, but not beyond repair. The hardest part will be finding the right tools to fix it." David's brow furrowed. "Bend space? You mean dash?" "Yes," Lyra interrupted, nodding. "My people discovered how to manipulate the fabric of space itself to travel vast distances. This ship runs on a source of energy that you have yet to fully understand, but with your help, I believe we can make the necessary repairs." David stared at her, his mind reeling. Faster than light travel? Manipulating space? He had spent his life working on old cars and outdated technology. Now, here he was, faced with a spacecraft from another planet, one that was far more advanced than anything he could have ever imagined. But Lyra was right. They had to try. There was no turning back now. "All right," David said, his voice steadying. "Let's see what we can do." As the two of them continued to inspect the ship, David couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up in this situation. The mundane life he had known was a thing of the past. Whatever this was, it was bigger than anything he had ever encountered. But for better or worse, he was in it now. And he wasn't going to let her down. As they began to work, the weight of what they were attempting to do settled on David's shoulders. Fixing broken things was what he knew best, but this was no ordinary repair job. This was something that would change his life and the entire course of history forever. And as the strange, shimmering ship began to hum to life under his hands, David realized one thing. Life, as he had known it, was over, and the real adventure had just begun. David's hands were shaking as he carefully examined the exposed components of Lyra's ship. The alien technology was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Every part of the craft seemed to hum with an energy that was almost alive, pulsing gently, as if responding to his touch. The metal wasn't like anything Earth had produced. It was lightweight yet durable, capable of withstanding forces that would obliterate any human-made material. As he ran his hands along the smooth surface of a control panel, David marveled at how the ship seemed to react to him. It was as though it recognized him, or at least understood that he was here to help. "All right, let's see," David muttered to himself, crouching low to get a better view of the intricate circuits that were exposed. "I've fixed a lot of things in my life, but this is something else." Lyra stood behind him, watching his every movement with an intensity that made him feel both scrutinized and somehow protected. She didn't speak, but her presence was reassuring, almost like she was waiting for him to unlock the secrets of her ship. The inside of the ship had been badly damaged, but there were parts of it that were still intact, like a heart that continued to beat even after being battered by an unseen force. David had always been good with machines, but this wasn't just a mechanical issue. This was something far beyond him. The ship wasn't like fixing a car engine, which was about understanding the system and applying brute force. This ship required finesse, patience, and an understanding of technology that David had never imagined. His hands, though steady, felt out of place as he traced the cables and conduits that were connected to the main power core. "What's this?" David muttered, pulling at a circuit that didn't quite match any of the others. It was an unfamiliar material, and when he pulled on it, a slight vibration hummed through his fingers, like the ship was alive. "That is the core conduit," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. It channels the energy required to power the warp drive and the primary systems. It was damaged during the crash. I cannot repair it alone. David glanced at her, trying to comprehend the enormity of what she was asking. You're telling me this? This thing is supposed to allow your ship to warp through space? Faster than light. Yes, Lyra nodded. It is called a space weave conduit. It is the heart of the ship, and without it functioning, I cannot leave this planet. David didn't know much about space travel, but what Lyra was saying sounded like something out of a sci-fi novel. Faster than light travel? Manipulating space itself? It was the kind of thing that belonged in the pages of fiction, not here in his quiet workshop. And yet, here he was, standing in front of an alien ship, trying to fix something that defied everything he thought he knew about physics and engineering. He exhaled slowly, his mind swirling with thoughts of what he was being asked to do. But there was no backing out now. He had made a promise to help her, and even if he didn't fully understand what he was doing, he knew he had to try. His life had been quiet, predictable until this moment. But now, standing here with the alien craft before him, David felt something stir inside him. Something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. All right, David said, straightening up, trying to shake off the feeling of being completely out of his depth. Let's see what we can do. I'll need to gather some parts, but we'll need to work quickly. The longer this ship sits here, the harder it'll be to fix. Lyra's gaze softened, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of hope and gratitude. Thank you, David. You don't understand how much this means to me. To us. David didn't know what to say to that. How could he understand? He was just a mechanic from a tiny town. But seeing her standing there, with the faintest hint of a smile on her face, he couldn't help but feel like he was on the brink of something huge. Something life-changing, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. Chapter 3. A Dangerous Request. The next few days were a blur of activity. David threw himself into the work, studying the alien ship's components, trying to make sense of its complex systems. He had managed to find a few replacement parts for the ship's primary circuits parts that were only vaguely similar to Earth technology, but the deeper David got into the repairs, the more he realized how much he didn't know. Some parts of the ship required tools he didn't have, others required materials that didn't exist on Earth. It was a puzzle, a daunting challenge, and yet, as he worked, he could feel the excitement building inside him. This wasn't just another repair job. This was a chance to solve the greatest puzzle he had ever encountered. Lyra was by his side every step of the way, helping where she could, offering insights into the ship's systems that he could never have understood on his own. The connection between them grew stronger as they spent hours together, often working late into the night, fueled by nothing more than the need to fix the ship and send her back home. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Lyra was incredibly capable, but she wasn't human, and there were moments when her alien perspective made him feel like he was on the outside of a conversation, struggling to understand things that were far beyond his grasp. One evening, as the repair work continued, Lyra approached him while he was inspecting the ship's engine manifold. The air between them felt heavy, like there was something unspoken lingering in the room. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "David," she began, her eyes searching his, "there is something I must ask of you. Something difficult." David turned to her, wiping his hands on a rag. The quiet seriousness in her tone made him pause. He could sense that whatever she was about to say was important, maybe even dangerous. "Of course," David replied, his voice steady. "What is it?" Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze lowering as though she was weighing her words carefully. "My people, our race is not like yours. We have abilities that you cannot even begin to comprehend. We are not born the same way you are. And when we answer nature's call, it is not the same for us." David blinked, confused by the sudden shift in conversation. "What do you mean? I don't understand." She seemed to hesitate, as though trying to figure out how to explain something so utterly foreign. When I go to the bathroom, as you would call it is not in the usual way for your species. We excrete precious substances, materials that are valuable, that are rare. And my people are bound by our biological processes." David stared at her, the weight of her words starting to settle in. He wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but the strange directness of it made him uncomfortable. "You mean, you don't go to the bathroom the way humans do?" Lyra nodded, her eyes flickering briefly with embarrassment, though she did her best to maintain her composure. Yes, my species, when we expel waste, it is not the same as your kind. What we produce, it's rare. It is something of immense value. David still wasn't entirely following her. Wait, are you saying, what you poop is valuable? But why are you telling me this? Lyra took another deep breath, her face serious. Because, David, I need you to understand. What I am about to say may sound strange, but it is important. What I produce is not just waste. It is a rare, powerful material. It is precious beyond your comprehension. And if I am to repair my ship, if I am to ever return to my people, it will need your help in a way that is unconventional. David's mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what Lyra was saying. She had just admitted to producing something rare and valuable when she went to the bathroom, but it didn't stop there. She was asking him for help. What did she mean? Help? How? He asked, his voice faltering slightly, unsure if he was hearing her correctly. Lyra's gaze hardened, and she met his eyes with an intensity that took David's breath away. I need you to collect the substance that I expel. Only then can I use it to complete the repairs. It is part of my biology, something necessary to power the warp conduits. But I cannot do it alone. I need you to assist me. Only you can help me access it. David's face went pale. He stared at her, his brain struggling to process her request. Wait, you want me to collect something you produce? His voice was flat, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Lyra nodded solemnly. Yes, you do not need to understand it all right now, but trust me, David, it is essential. Without your help, I will never be able to return to my people. I will be stranded here forever. The room seemed to close in on David as he stood there, unable to speak. Collecting alien waste? The request was as strange as it was unsettling, and yet the sincerity in her voice told him that she wasn't making this up. This wasn't some joke or bizarre misunderstanding. Lyra was asking him to help her in a way that pushed the boundaries of what was even conceivable, and yet, the desperation in her eyes, the gravity of her words, made it impossible for him to say no. David took a deep breath, his heart racing in his chest as he tried to come to terms with what was being asked of him. His mind was still processing, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the strangest request he had ever received in his life. All right, he said slowly, still trying to figure out what was going on in his own head. I'll help. But this is insane. Lyra gave him a faint, grateful smile. Thank you, David. You do not know how much this means to me. And so, as David prepared to help Lyra in ways he never could have anticipated, he realized that the strange journey he had begun had only just started. The next few hours felt like a strange dream, one that David couldn't quite wake up from. Lyra's request, though odd and unsettling, had been made with such sincerity that David found himself agreeing to help her, though every fiber of his being screamed in confusion. He had come into this with the intention of simply repairing a broken alien ship, not assisting an alien in collecting something as bizarre as waste. But as Lyra explained it, the process she referred to was essential to the survival of her species. Her people, it turned out, were not only biologically different from humans, but their excretion of this material was critical for their advanced technology. It was a byproduct of their biology, a substance so rare and concentrated that it had properties which could regenerate damaged systems and even power vital functions in their ships. As strange as it sounded, it was clear that this was the key to repairing the ship and sending her back to her home world. Lyra's voice, usually calm and collected, now carried a sense of urgency as she described how vital this substance was. She spoke of how it could heal her people's damaged technology and fuel their interstellar capabilities. But beyond all that, David saw something else in her, an edge of desperation that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just about getting home, it was about survival. David had spent hours with Lyra that evening, discussing the mechanics of the ship and what she needed to get it working again. In a quiet corner of the workshop, she showed him how to extract the rare material, something she called Vivorite. It was contained within a special part of her body and could only be accessed when certain biological processes were triggered. The process itself was delicate and needed to be done carefully, and once David had helped her, she would use the material to power the ship's critical systems. It was all so fantastical that David had to keep reminding himself that this was real, that he was standing in front of an alien woman who wasn't from this world, and who had crashed into his quiet town for reasons he still couldn't fully comprehend. David spent the next day preparing himself mentally for the task. The thought of helping an alien, in any capacity, was daunting enough. But assisting her in something so bizarre, so personal, made him feel even more uneasy. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe some scientific marvel, a machine that could collect it, or some sort of advanced tool. But when the time came, it wasn't as clinical as he had imagined. There was a strange kind of intimacy to the whole process, one that left him feeling incredibly vulnerable. Lyra was calm, more composed than he had expected, even when she explained what was about to happen. She had an air of dignity about her, and though the request was strange, she made it clear that this was simply how her people operated. There were no other options. It wasn't something she could do without help, and David had agreed. She never once showed any embarrassment or hesitation. "I trust you, David," she said, her voice quiet and reassuring. "I would not ask this of you if I did not believe you could handle it." The words felt like a weight on David's chest, but he swallowed his discomfort and nodded. "All right, let's do this." As she lay down, readying herself for the procedure, David was struck by how small she looked in the dim light of the workshop. Despite her alien origin and immense presence, there was something inherently fragile about her, as though she was no different from anyone else who had ever needed help. The process, once begun, was entirely alien in itself. Lyra's physiology was unlike anything David had ever seen, and as he carefully followed her instructions, he began to understand how bizarrely advanced her species was. What she produced wasn't waste in the human sense, it was more akin to an energy source, a vital material that could heal and regenerate. It wasn't just any substance. It was rare, valuable, and undeniably powerful. The moment it was collected, Lyra's energy seemed to shift. She breathed out a deep sigh of relief, and for the first time since their encounter, David saw her exhaustion. She was a being from another world, someone who had survived a catastrophic war, someone who had crash-landed on an unknown planet, yet the physical toll of what she had asked for was clear. "Thank you," Lyra said, her voice faint but filled with genuine gratitude. "You have no idea what this means." David nodded, not entirely sure what to say. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of disbelief, concern, and a strange sense of awe. It wasn't every day that a mechanic found himself assisting an alien in such an intimate way. But this wasn't about the bizarre nature of the request anymore. This was about doing something far greater than fixing a machine. It was about saving someone's life. Chapter 4. The Return to the Stars. Over the next few days, David worked tirelessly alongside Lyra to repair the ship. It wasn't an easy task. Some parts had been damaged beyond repair, and other sections of the craft required more advanced tools than he had at his disposal. But together, they made progress. Lyra's alien knowledge of technology helped guide him, and David's mechanical expertise proved invaluable as he fabricated parts from the limited resources they had. The once smoldering wreckage of the ship began to take shape again, its glowing surface gradually coming back to life as the vital systems powered up. Each new function that was restored seemed to bring a sense of renewed hope to Lyra. Her eyes, which had once been filled with sorrow and resignation, now sparkled with a sense of purpose. She was determined, and David couldn't help but admire her. He had gone from simply helping her fix a broken ship to being a part of something far bigger than anything he could have ever imagined. One evening, as they stood side by side, looking at the almost complete ship, Lyra turned to David. Her face was serious but warm as she spoke. "David," she began, her voice low, "I want to thank you again. You have done something for me that no one else could. You've given me the chance to return to my people." David shook his head, still in awe of the entire situation. "I didn't do much. You did most of the work. I just helped where I could." Lyra smiled, her glowing eyes softening as she looked at him. "You don't understand. You didn't just fix my ship. You fixed my soul, in a way. I was lost, stranded, without hope. And now, thanks to you, I have a way to go home. You gave me that. You gave me my future." David felt a lump rise in his throat. The gravity of what she was saying was overwhelming, and in that moment, he understood that this had never been just about fixing an alien ship. It had been about something far deeper. He wasn't just a mechanic in this moment. He was part of something greater. And though he had never expected his life to take such a turn, There was no denying the profound change it had brought to him. As they stood there, watching the final touches come together on the ship, the sky above seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. David couldn't explain it, but he felt as if he were witnessing the beginning of something that would resonate far beyond this moment. The ship powered up, its systems fully restored, and Lyra turned to David with a final, solemn expression. "It's time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "I guess it is." Lyra stepped toward the ship, her eyes meeting his one last time. "I can never repay you for this, David. But know that in my world, you will always be remembered. You have done more than you can ever imagine." David watched her as she boarded her ship, her figure disappearing into the glowing craft. The ship's engines hummed to life, and for a brief moment, David stood frozen, unsure of what to feel. This was the end of the road for them, a moment of departure. But as the ship began to rise into the sky, breaking through the atmosphere, David couldn't help but feel that he had been a part of something far greater than he could comprehend. And with that, the alien ship disappeared into the night sky, leaving David standing alone in the workshop, his life forever changed. He hadn't just helped an alien get home, he had touched the very fabric of the universe, something he could never fully grasp. As the last trace of the ship disappeared into the stars, David turned back to his workshop, the faint hum of the repaired engine still echoing in his ears. Life would return to normal, but David knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same.